So our next project line in abstraction is based upon the element of line, but it's also based upon two principles of art: unity and emphasis and focal point. We're going to talk about those two very briefly here and then show some student work examples. So like I said, first we're going to talk about the principle of unity. So one of the principles of art, unity, is is something that creates an integrated image and with all the elements are working together to support the design as a whole. Within a unified design, the design is greater than the sum of its parts. The design seems whole at first, and then the individual elements are noticed. Unity can be compared to harmony, integrity, or wholeness. Like we talked about before, in unity, there is an agreement among all the elements in a design. The elements feel like they belong together. These elements help to create a harmonious image. If an image is not harmonious, the elements appear separate or unrelated. If we look at the image on the left, what things help create harmony? Both the shape and color, right? The shape of the circles in the paint buckets, the colors that are repeated in different ways. We see the yellow that is seen sort of at the top, and then it's dripping down the edge over here. We see red repeated here in slightly different ways. It's used throughout, right? The overall composition should be dominant over its individual parts. So like if we think about a scrapbook, we don't want to look at each individual image, we want to take them as a whole. It's meant to create a visual unity, so there's a total unifying elements to the composition. So even though this had, for example, in this piece we see little individual parts of the buildings, the color and the shape helps to unify them together. Let's look at this piece. I'll give you a hint. This piece is possibly on your midterm exam. What elements of art in this composition help to unify? Well, first of all, we see shapes, right? We see squares, circles, rectangles, all repeated throughout in different ways. We see texture, and we see sort of that texture there in the middle, repeated in different parts, right? And color, right? This sort of off, sort of muted red, muted greens, repeated throughout in different ways, right? This can be done in both representational and non-representational compositions. Next, we're going to talk about some sort of principles of unity itself. We'll call it crap in unity, if you excuse that term. Things that help compositions have unity within them. So there is continuation, repetition, alignment, and proximity. We'll look at some examples of each of those. So in this piece by Edward Hopper, we see continuation, right? Look at the man's left arm and how it almost seamlessly connects to the dresser and to the woman's head and to the line all the way out the door. There's a continuation of line that draws us throughout that piece. Repetition is another example of unity. Repetition means to repeat something. Repetition can be used with any element of design: line, shape, space, value, texture, color, and their characteristics such as line, direction, and character. Repetition should not be used to create a predictable composition, but rather a harmonious one. For example, in this piece, we see variations within each of those squares. So even though we see repeated over and over again those rectangles, there's different changes in color or little variations in shape that help create interest. So what we're going to talk about is alignment, or the grid. Whenever you put things next to each other in a line, it helps to unify them. So we almost see them as parts of a story or a continuation of the same idea. Proximity means how close your elements are together. To unify the figures at the table, Caravaggio places them in proximity to one another. The small shapes of light up against the background show that they belong to a group of objects. He also, to place emphasis on them, he placed Jesus on the other side of the table, facing the other, so you can kind of see that singular hand sort of pointing towards the group. So we're going to talk about visual perception and gestalt. A gestalt is created because the mind simplifies and organizes information. It does this by grouping elements together to create new wholes. Understanding how the mind groups elements together helps us to understand how unity can be achieved. There are some principles of Gestalt, they're called the Gestalt laws, that include these 8 elements. You can kind of think about this as you're organizing your design. One is closure, meaning when you put visual groupings close together, it makes incomplete figures seem whole. So if we're looking at this little panda, right, we all see a panda. It's actually pieces of individual parts, but our eye pieces them together and it closes up the top, so we see the closed part of a head there, right? Common fate describes how objects moving together are perceived to belong together. This is known as the lemming effect. Continuity means objects aligned along a line or singular curve are perceived as belonging together. So we like to perceive the simplest, most smoothest, most complete path rather than a complex path. Figure versus ground, we talked about this before. It refers to the relationship between positive and negative shapes and how our eye separates whole figures from their background in order to understand what's being seen. Pragnaz, we organize our perceptions into the simplest possible experience. This is also known as the law of simplicity. Proximity means that objects near one another in space and time are believed as belonging together. So for example, in this tree, even though they're little separate brushstrokes, we see them as becoming the branches and leaves. Simplicity means that with similar characteristics such as form, color, size, and brightness are perceived as belonging together. It's why we sort of perceive this as a sun with the eagle in it. Well, symmetry explains our tendency to perceive symmetric shapes as figures on the background, like they belong together. So we see 1, 2, 3 objects. All right, so those are our overview of unity. Next, we're going to talk about the next principle of art, emphasis and focal point. So the next principle we're going to talk about is emphasis and focal point. We talked about these a little bit earlier in our introductory PowerPoint, but we're going to look at a few more examples right now. So focal point is the location in a composition that attracts the viewer's attention first and may be repeatedly drawn back to itself. A focal point is where an artist has deliberately placed emphasis within their composition. So if we had to pick some areas of emphasis within this, we really have two, right? The plate, and we've got the objects over here, with the rest being subordinate. Contrast is a way to create an area of emphasis or a focal point. Contrast refers to difference. So for example, those two bright leaves really stand out as focal points in this piece. Difference or contrast can be achieved by changing the characteristics of the elements of art. So line, shape, value, texture, color, all those things, seeing a sudden difference in contrast makes it stand out. Convergence is another way to create an area of emphasis or focal point. You use implied lines to direct the viewer's eye to an object or element. This is also known as convergence. Isolation shows our ability to isolate an element from others. So whenever one shape or element is separated from a group or area, it becomes isolated and in turn becomes a focal point. That's why we see that little guy over in the corner all by himself as one of the focal points. Placement. This is where objects are placed in the center of a picture or near the center. It will become a focal point. So most of the time, a non-centered focal point is preferred, but by placing an object or element off center, you can make a focal point placement without affecting the aesthetics of the artwork, because it sort of becomes a bullet point in the middle. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the rule of thirds. The last one is the unusual. So if something is different, an element that is unusual to the composition stands out and gets the viewer's attention first. Like I said, now we're going to talk about the rule of thirds. When the picture plane is divided into thirds, both vertically and horizontally, as a tool to arrange the elements in the composition, our eye tends to, it's a way to strengthen a composition by allowing that focal point to fall along one of those third elements. So important compositional elements should be placed along these lines or at their intersections. Like we talked about before, we don't want to put something right in the middle of a composition. Our eyes already going to want to go there, and we need a way to pull our eye back out to the other parts of the composition. So instead of placing it in that center square, we're trying to place it along those blue dots or those power points, which are best placement for focal points. Let's look at a few examples. For example, here, where the tree is one of those key elements, it creates a much more dynamic composition by placing the tree along one of those power points versus just smacking it right in the center. Another example, we have sort of our interesting area of the horses down along that bottom third, along the horizontal lines. Also along the vertical lines, it helps to create a dynamic composition. In this case, we've got the title, Slidology, and the figure, both one on a PowerPoint, the other along one of those important third lines. This helps to create, like I said, you're helping the viewer's eye to move around the page. It's a little more dynamic than just putting it in the middle. And those PowerPoints help to figure out a way to create a much more interesting composition. It's not so far to the edge, it's not quite in the middle, it's a little more dynamic. So we're going to talk about visual flow. Visual flow describes how a good composition is designed to lead the viewer's eye around the picture plane. Visual flow creates areas of movement and avoids stagnant areas. So for example, we've got our PowerPoints in this one. You can kind of see how our eye starts down here with these lines. It moves up to where the train is, back up through those PowerPoints, down through the smoke, then back down around to the other side. So our eye is moving throughout the picture frame. Visual flow can be created by using unity and emphasis and focal points. So all those things we talked about: proximity, repetition, continuation, directional lines, converging lines, value, and color. So let's look at this piece. How is visual flow created? This is both by converging lines and directional force. So if I start here by going along the lines, I move up to my focal point, follow it up off the page, and then this little triangle takes me back down around to the bottom. This one uses proximity, repetition, continuation, directional lines, light among dark, and color. So we've got our focal points. We also have some other objects leading us, these lighter objects, leading us back in through the page, back up around, back down, leading us throughout the picture plane. This one uses repetition, continuation, texture, contrast, large versus small. You can kind of see here, we've got these big orange pieces that help kind of draw us back up around through the piece. So we're thinking about our eye constantly moving. So we're going to look at some student examples. You are first going to have to pick out 24 magazine examples. This is the tricky part because you have to come up with 24. But you're just looking. You want to think about your eye, using that visual flow, your eyes moving around the page, and that you have unity and areas of emphasis and focal points. So let's look at a few student examples. Remember, even though these are from magazines, you might not have any recognizable objects inside of your piece. I'm going to think about using converging lines, direction, still using that line variety. Keeping pulling your eye throughout the piece and creating those kind of directional movements.